All right, so more breaking news right now, everybody. New overseas polls have just closed in France in the tightly contested presidential election, and we have new numbers from those exit polls. President Emmanuel Macron has been holding the narrowest of leads against far-right candidate Marine Le Pen in a race that could have incredibly significant international implications. We have two reports from Paris. CNBC's Karen So is at Macron campaign headquarters. CNBC's Charlotte Reed is with the Le Pen campaign as well. Karen, let me start with you on this one. We are expecting exit polls to come out very soon. What is the mood there as we await this?
Good evening from Paris. I can tell you the mood here is enthusiastic, but at the same time, very tense. You may recall that this is an election that has flown under the radar for weeks, playing second fiddle to the war in Ukraine, and it's only been on the eve of this election that concern has been seismic shift in politics that could potentially disrupt Europe. Now, the first exit poll came out a short time ago as the major polling stations across the country just closed. And what we have seen, the gap is wider than expected. At 28 for Emmanuel Macron, the president, just over 23 for the far-right challenger. Don't forget, seen as a French Donald Trump at just over 23. And to the far left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon at just over 20. So this is still a fairly tight contest between the second and third contender. But I can tell you, when the first exit poll was released, we did see cheering. The crowd here that are supporters of Macron certainly have been enthusiastic. But this is quite different. I stood in exactly the same spot 5 years ago, and Macron was seen as a movement. He was a breath of fresh air, a call for change. Now he's seen as the incumbent. And don't forget, no president in France in the last 20 years has been re-elected to the Élysée Palace. So it is quite a fight that he's got ahead of him. The big question is who turns out now in the second round in 2 weeks. Last time he had the left that came in to support him. There are concerns that there's so much anger around his reform program, the cost of living crisis, some of this triggered by the war in Ukraine, that he may face a challenge getting the same supporters to turn out. We've seen this time that turnout has been lower than in 2017. That's a trend we've seen in France for a number of years. At 5 o'clock, it was estimated it was down about 4 points. So that may have some bearing, but I think what we're seeing at this point, Emmanuel Macron is calling still for huge reform, change to the pension system, still changing working conditions in France. But he's up against a populist in Marine Le Pen that has been promising very large tax cuts here that may help shield the population from inflation. Inflation here is running roughly just over 5%, a couple of points lower than across the rest of Europe, because Macron did step in and ask the major energy companies to effectively take on the huge burden of rising energy prices. But still, it may not be enough to ward off the challenge in 2 weeks' time.
Karen, is there at all a fear there at Macron headquarters that if in fact he were to lose, France would lose its footing inside NATO? We look at Macron obviously as a leader right now during this time of peril in Europe as Russia continues its invasion, its war inside Ukraine. Macron has met several times with Putin as well, been a go-between, of course, during this very perilous time there. Is there a fear that if Le Pen, who is essentially friendly with Putin, if she wins, that there could be a major power shift?
It's a fantastic point. If you think this time around in 2017, we were talking about a country that was virtually living in a state of emergency after a spate of terrorist attacks, but it's changed. Now we're talking about the war in Ukraine. Emmanuel Macron seen as a power broker, initially trying to ward off the invasion with regular phone calls to Vladimir Putin. That said, versus his challengers from Marine Le Pen that has a campaign document that apparently had to be binned because it had a photo of her shaking hands with President Putin. But has also raised comments in the past about the role of France in NATO. Don't forget, France has pulled out of NATO before, so it's somewhat ambiguous as to what her stance still is around NATO. She has tried to double down and push back against some of her previous comments condemning the invasion, but still there are question marks around what this would mean for sanctions. She's made comments before about being concerned that Russia will realign with China down the track, so it does beg the question of just how tough any French president, that would be Le Pen, would be on sanctions, but also around NATO membership. I think that's been one of the big concerns too. And of course, I should mention the unity of Europe. She's not calling for Brexit and exit of France from the European Union this time round, but still a pushback against Brussels that could disrupt the unity that you've witnessed around a crisis.
Certainly a tense time in France. Karen, we appreciate your reporting on this very much so. We're going to be checking back, obviously, throughout the next few hours as exit polls continue to come out. With that, want to go over to Le Pen's campaign headquarters. That's where we find Charlotte Reed standing by for us. Charlotte, bring us up to date as the mood there on the ground as we are awaiting more of these exit polls.
Well, they are happy here at Marine Le Pen's headquarters. She arrived second in the polls. Look, she did less well than the last polls we had on Friday, about 23.3%. It is a good score for the far-right candidate. She was at 21% in 2017, so she's improved her score. But the gap between her and Emmanuel Macron has grown this time around. So a bit more of a challenge here. So now the challenge will be the next 2 weeks of running and campaigning between these two. And there's no doubt that her connections to Russia and to the Kremlin will be exposed massively by the Macron camp. We know that she had photos in 2017 shaking hands with Vladimir Putin that she's been a little bit embarrassed with now in this campaign since the war in Ukraine. So we're trying to put all of this away, but there's no doubt that the Macron camp will try to expose this as much as possible. So now in the next 2 weeks, we'll hear all the candidates that have lost also say who they will support for the second round. Traditionally, parties support the most centrist candidates to block the far right, but it seems that this time around it might get a little bit trickier to block this. And here you hear some reactions as a center-right candidate has called to vote for Emmanuel Macron. So you hear the reaction here at the Marine Le Pen camp not being happy about this call. That's really what's at stake now. The candidates will go for who they support, and in the next 2 weeks it will be gloves off between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen.
We'll be watching as this develops. Charlotte Reed, thank you as well.